Good evening, everyone. This evening, I'm joined by Ron Unz, the publisher of the Unz Review. How are you tonight, Ron?
Fine, fine. Great to be here.
So, yeah, let's get this show on the road. So, I really enjoyed reading your three-part series in the American Pravda regarding McCarthyism, especially the last part, the third part that talks about the Jewish angle. And the thing that really stuck out to me with regards to your analysis is how you tried to sift through and present the late Senator Joseph McCarthy in a much more nuanced light, because you obviously have a liberal narrative that just excoriates him. And then you have more of a, I'd say, emerging populist right narrative that has vindicated McCarthy over like the last few decades, saying like this guy was able to smoke out communists within the government, which was actually true in the decades prior to the 30s and 40s. There was notable evidence of significant communist and Soviet infiltration. However, you brought in a more balanced perspective, noting that McCarthy not only made some kind of certain hyperbolic claims that had some nuggets of truth to it, but that he was ultimately played by Jewish interests. So to start off, what is your general assessment of McCarthyism and where did it go wrong?
Well, strangely enough, I think, in fact, the most accurate portrayal of McCarthy as part of McCarthyism is something fairly close to the traditional liberal narrative. In other words, a very harsh treatment of him, in that he really didn't find almost any communists during his career. In other words, there were certainly many, many very significant communist infiltrators in the American government. The American government, certainly during the 1930s and well into the 1940s, came very close to falling under the control of Soviet agents, Soviet communist agents. But McCarthy himself actually had nothing to do with that period of time. In other words, McCarthy came into the issue pretty much at the point at which most of those Soviet agents had already been revealed and caught. And McCarthy himself, basically until, really the early 1950s, McCarthy had no interest in the issue. He basically paid no attention to it. And when he got involved in the issue, he focused many times on individuals who, while they were possibly sympathetic to the Soviet Union and certainly might have been considered, communist leaning or communist oriented, in almost all cases, they were not communist agents and they were not members of the Communist Party, even though McCarthy sometimes said or implied that they were. So, in other words, even though, it's certainly true that America had been subjected to a massive amount of very high-level communist infiltration, which, people like Whittaker Chambers and Richard Nixon had done very much to combat and, smoke out. McCarthy himself, by making all sorts of wild accusations, and in many cases false wild accusations, did tremendous damage to the anti-communist case. And that really surprised me a bit. And that, for example, as I started reading through many of these books, many of the individuals regarded as McCarthy's closest advocates and supporters. For example, William F. Buckley, who, had written a book in, I think it was probably 1952 or 1953, McCarthy and His Enemies, which was one of the very few books published in that period considered sympathetic to McCarthy. And William F. Buckley's brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, who actually went to work for McCarthy as one of McCarthy's staffers, their book actually was very critical of much of McCarthy's behavior. And so, if McCarthy's strongest supporters sharply criticized his behavior, that made an impression on me. What's also interesting is that then 40 odd years later, towards the end of his life, William F. Buckley published a book, a sort of semi-fictional version of McCarthy called The Red Hunter. in a sense, taking some of these individuals, Buckley himself, his brother-in-law, and a few other characters, and creating them as a sort of fictional character in the work dealing with McCarthy's period. And many of the aspects of that book, written 40 years after McCarthy had left the scene, were extremely critical of McCarthy's behavior. So probably the best way to sum it up is McCarthy's basic argument was absolutely correct. America had been infiltrated by numerous Soviet communist agents who came very close to gaining control of the American federal government, which is simply astonishing. But even though that broad issue was correct, most of the individual points McCarthy made, most of the individual McCarthy focused on and accused, really had nothing to do with that. I mean, they were either very minor figures or in some cases probably innocent of the charges McCarthy made. So because McCarthy made all these sorts of wild accusations and damaged his own case that way, he made it relatively easy for the anti-communists, in other words, the people who wanted to debunk the anti-communist movement, to portray all of the anti-communist movement as being as, incompetent or wild or, basically unsubstantiated as McCarthy himself was. Now, again, the contrast, for example, between someone like Richard Nixon, who played a huge role in breaking the Alger Hiss case, and showing that one of the most important influential figures in the Roosevelt administration, someone at a very high level, who might have easily become Secretary of State a few years down the road, was a communist agent. So, Nixon really was somebody much more cautious and careful in his accusations, while someone like McCarthy just used a blunderbuss to launch all these accusations against people who really were not at all communist agents. In fact, at one point, McCarthy, for example, described someone named Owen Lattimore as being the number one communist Soviet agent in America. And he basically said he would stake his entire reputation, his entire career on that. And there's absolutely no evidence that Lattimore was even a member of the Communist Party, let alone any sort of communist agent. Lattimore certainly was, you could say, pro-communist. He was friendly with communists. He was aligned with the communist movement, but he was not a member of the Communist Party. And you could even argue that Lattimore was no more friendly with the communists or with the Soviet Union than the entire federal government had been under the Roosevelt administration. In other words, Lattimore's views were very much in keeping with that of most of the top figures of the Roosevelt administration during that period. The one difference is Lattimore kept his views afterwards, when many of the other top American officials then sort of became much more cautious in what they said. So, again, if you accuse somebody of being the number one Soviet communist agent in America, and you say you'll stake your reputation on that accusation, and based on all the evidence, it turns out to be a false accusation, you're really doing tremendous damage to your own side, to your own case. And that, unfortunately, I think, is the truth about McCarthy.
Given all this information, what was the whole point of McCarthy's anti-communist outbursts then? Was he being used as a tool? Because that's what you noticed, what you suggested in the Jewish angle of your series. What role did he play exactly then?
It's really a very interesting story. Now, in modern times, when you're talking about conservative or really conspiratorial issues, it's very common to use the phrase controlled opposition. In other words, in conspiratorial circles, many times everybody is accusing everybody else of being a member of the controlled opposition. Wild accusations like that are made all the time. As far as I can tell, Senator Joseph McCarthy was an honest to goodness figure in controlled opposition. In other words, the story of how he got involved in the anti-communist movement is really a fascinating one. Apparently, a lot of Jewish leaders had gotten very concerned, since so many of the communist spies were Jewish. And communism and Jews were so closely identified. For example, I think by most estimates, well over half of the communist leaders in the United States, including the agents of the Soviet Union, were actually Jewish. So many non-communist Jewish figures became very concerned about that identification, especially once the facts started coming out in the mid to late 1940s and the early 1950s. And apparently, some of the top non-communist Jewish figures, really decided that it was important to sort of set up an anti-communist movement that would deliberately focus on non-Jews, on Gentile communists, and sort of avoid focusing on the very large number of Jewish communists. So apparently what they did was they got some of the FBI reports on, a number of the people suspected of being communists or aligned with the communist movement. They used their connections, apparently, to get it from J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. And they went around to several prominent U.S. senators offering that material to them. In other words, they gave them all the briefing materials and they said, we would like you to lead the anti-communist effort in the United States, to become a top figure in that movement. We will give you all the funding you need. We will give you media support. We will give you all of this information. All you have to do is use the tools that we're giving you to attack these communist figures. But with the one condition being, you have to avoid attacking Jewish communists. And you have to focus almost entirely on non-Jewish communists. So apparently they went around to 4 separate U.S. senators. And the first 3 senators they went to turn them down, either because they were very nervous about attacking communists, who were still quite powerful at the time, or because they didn't want to go along with the agreement, or simply because they had other issues to focus on. But McCarthy was looking for a re-election issue. In other words, he hadn't really been that popular, successful senator. He won election the first time almost as a fluke. And so he was desperately seeking a re-election issue in 1952. And he focused on the communist issue. So in other words, he went along with exactly what they were saying. And that answers some of the puzzles that I had, because McCarthy was not a prominent U.S. senator. And the entire McCarthyite movement began when he gave a speech denouncing communism to a group of Republican women in Wheeling, West Virginia, which is not exactly the media center of the United States. And so I was always a little bit puzzled that he got so much media coverage for his anti-communist accusations made in a fairly unimportant setting in a, fairly minor part of the country. When, on the other hand, many far more important U.S. senators had given similar speeches denouncing communism and attacking the communist movement in the United States, in the media capitals of New York or Washington, D.C., and had gotten only a fraction of McCarthy's attention. And I think what probably happened is the Jewish groups that came to him, they'd promised him media support. And given their tremendous influence over the media, they were probably the ones who ensured that his fairly obscure speeches got tremendous media coverage around the country. So in effect, they created McCarthy as the leader of the anti-communist movement in the United States under the condition that McCarthy would focus almost entirely on non-Jewish communists and avoid the much larger number of Jewish communists around. And that actually relates to something that Richard Nixon said in one of his private conversations that was taped and later released. Nixon had been one of the first elected officials in the United States to really courageously take on the communists, to basically finger Alger Hiss. I mean, Nixon's career could have been destroyed if he hadn't been able to prove that Alger Hiss was a communist agent the way he was. I mean, Alger Hiss was was a very powerful political figure in the United States. He was head of the Carnegie Endowment. He'd been a top State Department official. He had huge numbers of friends and advisors all around. I mean, the Secretary of State in the Truman administration said that, he was absolutely sure Hiss was 100% true blue American and he would stick by him and everything like that. So, I mean, Richard Nixon took tremendous risks in going after Alger Hiss. Decades later in the White House, Nixon said that, in his involvement with the House Un-American Activities Committee, one problem that he and most of the other members of that committee who were going after communist infiltration in the United States had is that such a huge fraction of all the communist agents were Jewish. And so they were very nervous about being perceived as anti-Semitic. And therefore, they made every effort to try to track down whatever non-Jewish communists they could find and focus as much as possible on those, simply to balance out the much larger number of Jewish communists that immediately came to their attention because they were such a large fraction of the total. And so, Nixon basically said he and the other elected officials tried to do exactly that. They tried to make sure that they were going after at least some non-Jewish communists, as well as the much larger number of Jewish communists. And that's actually probably one reason why Alger Hiss, who was non-Jewish, was such a desirable target to them. While, so many of the other communists, including, for example, Harry Dexter White, who was probably even more important than Alger Hiss in terms of the American government, who were Jewish, were, not necessarily the most ideal targets for, these anti-communist figures to go after. And so, but the difference in the case of McCarthy is McCarthy tried to avoid going after any Jewish communists. And one thing that I noticed, even before I'd heard that, even before I'd come across those statements that were explained, how he gotten involved in that, in the Buckley book about McCarthy that was published in, I think, 52 or 53, 10 individuals were named as the key individuals that McCarthy went after in his initial hearings. And all 10 of those individuals were Gentiles. Now, since I knew perfectly well that probably 70 to 80% of the prominent Jewish spies in America were prominent communist spies in America were Jewish, it just seemed very odd to me if 10 out of 10 of the ones McCarthy went after were Gentile. And so it was not at all surprising when I later came across that legal affidavit where somebody, put down on paper the fact that he specifically had heard from the people on the inside of the Jewish League Against Communism, how they had found McCarthy, how they created McCarthy, and what McCarthy agreed to do as part of the deal in exchange for the money, information, and media support that he got. And in fact, exactly the same story then appeared in a book written about J. Edgar Hoover by, a fairly well-regarded crime writer. So in other words, it's not just that one affidavit. It, was fully confirmed by a second source. So I think it really probably was true. And everything I saw about McCarthy's career, including the fact that he hired Roy Cohen, who was Jewish, as his top aide and advisor, certainly very strongly supports that reconstruction of events. So really what had happened was the anti-communist or non-communist Jewish leaders in America decided to put together a sort of damage control operation to, as much as possible, divert attention from the very large number of Jewish communist agents that had already been found in American society, with, the Rosenbergs being a perfect example of that. I think the Rosenbergs were arrested something like within a week or two of the time that McCarthy launched his original anti-communist crusade. So, things like that certainly made it easier for him to raise his profile. And the fact that he deliberately hired Jewish aides and advisors and focused so much attention on non-Jewish communist agents very much served the purpose of these Jewish groups that had sort of found and recruited him.
What Jewish groups in particular were disproportionately involved, like specific organizations in this entire process?
Well, it was one Jewish group in particular. It was called, I think, the Jewish League Against Communism. And, again, as far as I can tell, all the members of that league were certainly sincere in that they were opposed to communism and opposed to Jewish communists. But they were also very concerned about Jews in general in America developing a reputation of being communists, which, a very large number of them were. Also, I should say that, for example, if you read some of the sociological studies of the period, the polls of the period, McCarthy was extraordinarily unpopular among American Jews, because even though only a small fraction of American Jews were outright communist, a much larger fraction were sort of in that left-wing orbit. They were liberals or left liberals or communist leaning or communist sympathetic. And so by far of all the groups in American society, Jewish groups disliked and opposed McCarthy the most, and they regarded him as anti-Semitic. They believed that he was anti-Semitic, even though his top aides were Jewish, and even though he'd, secretly been created and promoted by the Jewish League Against Communism, or I think that was its name. It was something like the Jewish League Against Communism.
Yeah, American Jewish League Against Communism.
Exactly.
So I'm thinking about this big picture as well, because this is also the height of McCarthy's campaign. His time in the Senate was in the early 50s to mid 50s. And when you look at the geopolitical landscape of the time, Israel was a fledgling state that actually did receive diplomatic cover and military aid from the Soviet Union through its proxy in the Czech Republic. But in the 50s, though, you started to gradually see Israel rely more on U.S. and just more broadly Western aid. And when I look at groups like the American Jewish League Against Communism and these other more anti-communist Jews, based on your research of this topic, do you see also a play by these groups to move from communism towards more conventional Zionism, like groups like the AJLAC, just trying to discipline the Jewish community into going more of the Zionist route as opposed to the more communist Stalinist route?
Absolutely. I mean, that certainly was a major factor in that basically in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was a sharp break between the Zionist Jews and the communist Jews, partly because Stalin had originally viewed the creation of the State of Israel as being sort of a potential Soviet client state in the Middle East. In other words, to balance out some of these client states that the British and French had in the region. But Stalin then became very suspicious of the Jews, including the Jews in the Soviet Union, in that he saw that many of them were becoming very pro-Israel and Israel nationalist almost. So in other words, for example, many of the Stalinist communists, in fact, at the highest ranks of the Soviet Union, seemed to suddenly be developing strong emotional ties to the State of Israel. And Stalin became very concerned that whereas he had thought he would be using the State of Israel as a vehicle for his Soviet communism, he started to become concerned that possibly the State of Israel was instead gaining a strong internal degree of power in the Soviet Union among many of the very powerful Jews in the Soviet Communist Party. And so, in fact, Stalin then ended up executing large numbers of the Jewish communists who were running some of the Eastern European countries, like in Czechoslovakia. He ended up executing most of the Jewish leaders there, and he purged the Jewish communists from a lot of the other countries, in that he was suspicious that they might be more, in effect, Jewish than they were communists. And especially the creation of the State of Israel and the tremendous wave of Jewish nationalism that aroused made Stalin very, very nervous. And I mean, Stalin was a very paranoid person anyway. So it's quite possible that many of the people he executed or purged, he mistakenly accused or believed of that. But probably in some cases, he had some reasonable suspicions behind his accusations. So that break between the Zionist Jews and the communist Jews certainly impacted the political landscape in the United States. The other factor was that one important fraction of the communist Jews in the United States had always been the Trotskyite communist Jews, who obviously were very hostile to Stalin and the Soviet Union. And so many of them then gradually almost formed an alliance with the Zionist Jews, or in some cases became Zionist Jews themselves. So those groups were obviously very eager to fight against the infiltration of Stalinist communist Jews in the United States. And, certainly were, very willing to try to root them out. And so in many cases, then they ended up playing an important role in the anti-communist movement in the United States, even though they were ideologically, at least at first, still very much aligned with communism in general. They obviously were very hostile to Stalinist communism, who were their mortal enemies, and they'd been fighting for decades. So some of these groups, I'm trying to remember some of their names, like, for example, the Shachmanites. One important early communist leader had been somebody named Shachman, and he sort of developed his own communist faction that was hostile to the Stalinist communists. And then obviously there were all the regular Trotskyite communists, many of them who then gradually became neoconservatives down the road, and also other independent communists. I mean, a lot of the neoconservatives early on were individuals who'd started off being non-Stalinist communists or non-Stalinist leftists. So their hostility towards the sort of mainstream Soviet espionage was certainly genuine because they were from a rival communist sort of faction. But I mean, in the case of McCarthy himself, I don't know really how well McCarthy himself was aware of any of this stuff. I mean, McCarthy himself, if you take, for example, the conventional liberal accusations against communism, that he was sort of a drunken liar who was totally untrustworthy. I mean, most of it, as far as I can tell, is entirely true. I mean, and again, it's one thing when you read books very hostile to McCarthy, making those accusations. But when you read books written by McCarthy's strongest advocates and supporters, and they grudgingly admit that he was a pathological liar who was drunk all the time, I mean, that's sort of, you take it very seriously. And that really is true. I mean, McCarthy basically destroyed himself because of his wild accusations, including his attacks on the U.S. Army. He also seemed to be a fairly sort of corrupt individual. I mean, involved in all sorts of very sleazy financial dealings. And I mean, in some ways, when you think of somebody who willingly becomes a member of the controlled opposition, somebody who'd never had any interest in communism before and then suddenly became the leader of the anti-communist movement in the United States because he was sort of hired for that role by the Jewish Anti-Communist League. I mean, you'd expect somebody like that to be sort of a sleazy type of person who would be dishonest and unreliable and corrupt, and that's exactly what McCarthy was. So, I mean, the problem that really posed is prior to McCarthy coming along, people like Nixon and some of the other Whittaker Chambers had very effectively pointed to what really amounted to a near communist takeover of the top ranks of the American government. I mean, just to give an example of how incredibly close America came to being run by communists, you might, there's a fairly prominent political figure from that era named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace had been agriculture secretary in the Roosevelt administration, and then Roosevelt named him a vice president in 1940. So Roosevelt's vice president from 1940 onward was Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace was an absolutely true blue 100% American patriot. There's not the slightest evidence that Wallace was in any way a communist or even sort of a secret communist or anything like that, or sympathetic to the Soviet Union in that way. But Wallace was a very, very gullible individual. He was involved in all sorts of bizarre religious beliefs, And he was also very gullible politically. So all of Wallace's top aides and advisors were actually communist agents, agents of the Soviet Union. And in fact, later on, Wallace was Roosevelt's vice president in 1940. In fact, probably one reason Roosevelt picked Wallace as his vice president is Roosevelt knew he needed the support of the pro-communist faction in America to get renominated for his third term and, win an election. And so he probably thought by bringing in Wallace as VP, he would sort of make sure that the powerful pro-communist faction in the Democratic Party did everything they could to get a nominee elected. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, that's speculation, but, it's plausible speculation. But the point is, Roosevelt was a very ill man during his third term, and he died towards the beginning of his fourth term. So if Wallace had been renominated in 1944, as he almost was, or if Roosevelt had died a year earlier than he did, Henry Wallace would have become president of the United States. And years later, when Henry Wallace ran for president on his own Progressive Party ticket, he only got, I think, like 1% or 2% of the vote, if even that. He was never a serious candidate. But his entire campaign was run by the communist movement in the United States, probably without his even being aware of it. And he later said that if he'd been elected, he probably would have appointed Harry Dexter White as Secretary of the Treasury. And he probably would have appointed, I'm trying to remember the man's name, another person who was a Soviet agent as Secretary of State. So in other words, we're talking about a Wallace administration that would have had Soviet communist agents running the Treasury Department, the State Department, and probably most of the other top departments. I mean, in a sense, America's federal government would have been controlled by the Soviet Union, which is really astonishing, but it's absolutely true. I mean, that's exactly what had happened. If Roosevelt had died a little bit earlier, or if he'd renominated Wallace as his fourth-term VP. So, I mean, the concern that people have, all of these wild accusations by anti-communists during the 1940s and 1950s, of the tremendous threat of Soviet communism was absolutely 100% true. In fact, probably far worse than any of them ever dreamed or imagined, because a lot of this didn't come out until the Venona decrypts were declassified in the mid-1990s. These were the code-breaking efforts by the American Military Intelligence Service they basically were able to break the Soviet codes, and, with tremendous effort, they were able to find the identities of dozens or even hundreds of the Soviet agents in the American government, many of them at a very, very high level. Let me give you an example. Harry Dexter White was only on paper, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. But his superior, who was Secretary of the Treasury in the Roosevelt administration, was Henry Morgenthau. Henry Morgenthau had never graduated either high school or college. He was basically a dilettante, very wealthy gentleman farmer who knew nothing about finance. He was a totally ignorant individual. So he let Harry Dexter White, who was a Soviet agent, run the entire Treasury Department. Not only that, but towards the end of the Roosevelt administration, towards the end of the war, Harry Dexter White had successfully extended his power into the State Department. So he was running the State Department, much of the State Department, as well as the Treasury Department, and he was a Soviet agent the whole time. So I mean, we're talking about nothing. I'm not aware of any time in the history of the world where a major country has come so close to being totally under the control of the agents of a quite hostile other country. So, I mean, so all of these anti-communist accusations were entirely true during that entire period. And then, obviously, when Nixon was able to break the Alger Hiss case and prove that Alger Hiss was a Soviet agent, I mean, that started sort of a flood of accusations going. Prior to McCarthy, most of the people making these accusations were fairly careful to make accusations that were documented, that could be proven, and that were correct. Then McCarthy came along and started making wild accusations, large numbers of extremely wild accusations, with his crusade being promoted quietly from behind the scenes by these powerful Jewish figures who had a lot of access to the mainstream media and could, make McCarthy sort of the public face of anti-communism in the United States. And so the problem with that is, for a couple of years, McCarthy generated a tremendous anti-communist movement in the United States, much more. He got much more visibility for anti-communism than would have ever been the case if he'd not come along. In other words, it never would have gotten a fraction of the attention they got. But since so many of his accusations were false and were eventually proven to be false, and he was such a disreputable, wild individual himself, when he finally was broken and destroyed, when Eisenhower, the Republicans, and the Democrats got together with the U.S. military to sort of destroy him and have him censured by the Senate, that then became a weapon that the anti-communists could use to, for decades afterwards, denounce any accusations of communism as being McCarthyism. So in other words, it then became very, very difficult for anti-communists to get any public hearing in the media or in the political arena, because basically they were immediately accused of being McCarthyites. And since McCarthy had proven himself to be so disreputable and so unreliable, it was a very effective accusation. Now, again, many of the people accused of being McCarthyites were not at all in that category. But, given the fact that the media was so hostile to them, liberals were so hostile to them, it was relatively easy for the media and the liberals to sort of smear all anti-communists as being McCarthyite liars. And so McCarthy, I think on balance, did tremendous damage to the anti-communist movement in the United States. And that seemed to be the verdict of William F. Buckley, who, 40 or 50 years later in his book, The Red Hunter, who at the time had been one of McCarthy's strongest supporters and advocates in the media. But, in the view of hindsight, I think he saw clearly that McCarthy had done tremendous damage to the anti-communist movement in the United States, partly not only he himself, but also Roy Cohn and some of the other people he hired in his movement. Just to give you one example of how bizarre it was, one of the key people McCarthy tried to bring on board in his movement was actually a Christian preacher. I think, I'm not sure if he was a Christian preacher, but he was certainly, not at all Jewish. A strong Christian. And he ended up then writing an article for, I think it was either the American Mercury, might have been even Reader's Digest, with the article beginning by saying the strongest base of communism in the United States are Christian ministers. Now, when you make an accusation like that, which was A, utterly false, and B, incredibly inflammatory, you're really doing tremendous damage to your own cause. And I think from what I know, he was also one of the people who was sort of in the orbit of the Jewish League Against Communism. So in fact, they might have even persuaded him to write those inflammatory remarks. Now, it's certainly true that there were some Christian ministers who were pro-communist, as you would find in any sort of movement. But to say that the strongest base of communism in the United States was among Christian ministers was not a very good way to win friends and influence people in a country that was 97 or 98% Christian. And things like that did tremendous damage to the anti-communist cause in the United States.
Would you say that the McCarthyite project was the opening salvo of a broader Jewish movement to effectively kosherize anti-communism? And what I mean by that is create a acceptable anti-communist movement that would not critique Jewish power or Israel and stuff like that?
Very much so. In fact, as far as I can tell, that was the explicit plan of the Jewish League Against Communism. In other words, again, things can sort of be spun in a negative way or a positive way. To spin it in a positive way, they certainly wanted to sort of do what they could to sort of stamp out communism in the United States. They wanted as much as possible to shift American Jews away from communism. That was one of their main goals, to sort of make sure that, as many Jews as possible were shifted away from communism. But, as part of that project, they wanted to make sure that they could produce an anti-communism movement in the United States that avoided any sort of critique of Jewish communism or Jewish power, or the fact that, basically 70 or 80% of all the communist agents in the United States were Jewish and had been for decades. So, that certainly was true. And I think that, that partly because of the negative impact of McCarthy and some of these other people, I think it put the anti-communist movement in a difficult position. So in other words, with the anti-communist movement, having lost so much of its mainstream credibility, they probably were much more eager to win support wherever they could. And with these Jewish groups offering them funding, offering them media support, offering them anything they could, as well as, offering them many ardent anti-communist Jews who'd become part of their organization and could prove that they weren't anti-Semitic in any way. That, I think, made a huge difference. And in fact, that's certainly one of the factors why McCarthy made Roy Cohn his top advisor. What's interesting is McCarthy had been under pressure to name Robert F. Kennedy his top aide. And because one of McCarthy's strongest backers had been Joseph Kennedy, who was, very strongly anti-communist, and he very much wanted Robert Kennedy to become McCarthy's top, chief counsel on his committee. But McCarthy ended up going with Roy Cohn instead. And I think certainly one of the contributing factors, since they knew that despite their best efforts, many of the communists that they would be investigating would be Jewish, and since they were very nervous about being accused of being anti-Semitic, McCarthy probably and the other committee members believed that if they brought on board at a very high level Jewish anti-communists, then the result would be that they would be partially insulated against those accusations. One of the problems was Roy Cohn was an awful person. Not only was he really dreadful in terms of when I ended up reading a relatively sympathetic biography of him. But to be honest, aside from the fact that he was anti-communist, and I think he was a sincere anti-communist, I couldn't think of one positive thing to say about his entire lifelong career. Everything bad you can say about a person, corrupt, dishonest, criminal, just everything was clearly Roy Cohn. And he also was a terrible figure to have running the committee under McCarthy. In other words, Roy Cohn ended up then attacking the U.S. Army. And basically, Roy Cohn threatened the U.S. military with investigations unless the military basically gave all sorts of special favors to Cohen's close friend and likely lover. Basically, Roy Cohn had brought a totally unqualified individual who came from a wealthy Jewish family to be one of the members of his council. And there are very strong suspicions that Cohen and Sheen were actually homosexual lovers. So, and then when Sheen was then drafted by the military, Sheen had basically been able to dodge the draft before, but when he was finally drafted by the military, Cohen ended up calling the top figures in the U.S. military dozens of times, threatening them in the strongest possible way with investigations, with destruction, with attacks on the U.S. military, unless Sheen was given all sorts of incredibly special treatment, including basically that Sheen would then be allowed to go back and serve on McCarthy's committee simply as, his military service. Basically that he'd be made an officer, that he'd be given all these special privileges. Now, that was basically at a point in time when American GIs were fighting and dying in Korea, when 400,000 Americans had died in the Second World War, many of them draftees. And so back then, the notion of giving special privileges and special treatment to somebody just because they came from a wealthy, powerful family, even though it many times happened, was still viewed in a very negative light by the American public. Especially if probably it was because the guy being given the special treatment was the homosexual lover of the guy running McCarthy's committee. And also, there were all sorts of accusations that McCarthy himself might have been homosexual. Those accusations probably weren't true, but they were widely in circulation at the time. So in other words, things like that did tremendous, tremendous damage to McCarthy's political standing. And those were the factors that destroyed McCarthy in the Army McCarthy hearings. And so once McCarthy had been politically destroyed, the enemies of the anti-communist movement were able to slur all of the anti-communists as being very much like McCarthy, being another Joseph McCarthy. And that's why basically for decades afterwards, really there was no effective anti-communist movement in the United States. And that the successful cases like Alger Hiss, like Harry Dexter White, were basically ignored by the media. And in many cases, for example, until the Venona decrypts came out in the 1990s, most of the media in the United States still claimed that the people accused of being communist agents in the 1940s and 1950s were actually innocent. They claimed that really almost all of them were innocent. They even claimed, for example, that the Rosenbergs were innocent, despite the mountain of evidence against them. And so McCarthy really was the figure who, I'm not saying McCarthy did this as intentional sabotage, but he himself was such an incompetent, disreputable individual that did so much damage to the anti-communist cause that he probably set back the cause of anti-communism for 20 or 30 years. In his own efforts. Mm-hmm. And so, that's why personalities sometimes make a huge difference in American politics.
Roy Cohn has come into the spotlight again because of the Trump, that recent movie, The Apprentice, which features Cohn, who was a mentor to Donald Trump. And from what I've read about Roy Cohn's life, he was a really shady figure, especially post-McCarthy, where he'd interact with some of the seediest people in the underworld that had connections to the Jewish mafia. In fact, he has some really strange connections to the more underworld pro-Zionist factions of the Jewish mafia that continue to this day that even Donald Trump is connected to. Would you say Roy Cohn, given a lot of the work he's done from McCarthy up until his death in the 80s, was one of the most important figures in American Jewry, from getting Jews to go from the radical left, communist left, towards a more neoliberal, neoconservative orientation?
Well, I certainly think he was important. I don't know if I'd say he was that important, because Roy Cohn was hated by most of the Jewish community in New York City. In other words, the mainstream Jewish community hated Roy Cohn, partly because he was anti-communist and identified with Joseph McCarthy. And also, he was a very disreputable person. In other words, he was involved with organized crime all the time. To give you an example, when I was reading that, again, sympathetic biography of him, Cohen quite often stole money from his clients. He basically stole money. And his clients basically, in some cases, were fearful of demanding their money back or bringing the police in on the case because they thought Roy Cohn might have them killed using his mafia connections. So in other words, when you're a lawyer, you steal large sums of money from your own clients, and your clients are afraid to do anything about it for fear that you might have them killed by your mafia friends. That's a pretty disreputable position to be in. And he'd been brought into a law firm and he destroyed the law firm. He just incredibly sleazy, disreputable person in every way. So he was certainly a very powerful figure. He had so many different connections, many of them through blackmail. In other words, Roy Cohn was very good at accumulating blackmail evidence against powerful people. So in other words, he would leverage that blackmail evidence to get powerful people to do what he wanted and to get them to trade favors with other powerful people. So, for example, the Catholic Church used Roy Cohen, organized crime used Roy Cohen, legitimate real estate developers used Cohen, corporations used Roy Cohen. Roy Cohen was a very, very powerful figure in the world of connections and secret arrangements. And also, he was very good. You could use his connections then to get 3 cases thrown out of court. So, for example, if you were being prosecuted for something and you were guilty, there was a pretty good chance Roy Cohen might be able to use his connections to possibly blackmail the judge or call in favors to get the case against you thrown out. And that's why the mafia, was so used Roy Cohen so much with many of their activities. So, I mean, basically, Roy Cohen was very powerful. I don't know if he had that much and he certainly was powerful within certain segments of the Jewish community, including certain very powerful Jewish figures. For example, the guy who runs one of the a very wealthy Jewish billionaire, I'm trying to remember the name, a media billionaire who owns the New Yorker and a whole series of properties. He actually had been a very close friend of Roy Cohen going back to the time that they were, I think, in junior high or high school. So, again, certain very powerful Jewish figures were close to Roy Cohen, but I think a much larger number of New York Jews and powerful Jews around the country just hated and detested Roy Cohen. So I'm not sure. I mean, so Roy Cohen certainly was important in the way you're saying, but I don't know if I'd put him, maybe he was one of like the 10 most important Jews who helped shift Jews away from pro-communism, but I don't know if I'd put him anywhere near, the absolute top.
Yeah, he seemed more like somebody that I would say is like a full blown I wouldn't describe him like a full blown AIPAC activist, but I've seen a good deal of pro-Zionist publications speak well of him years after the fact, despite his very checkered past, because it kind of reminds me too of the likes of Meyer Lansky and other members in the Jewish underworld that played a relatively less covered, a more covert role in advancing Jewish interests in one way or the other. Now, when you talked about blackmail, do you see a parallel with Cohen and Jeffrey Epstein?
That's actually a fairly reasonable parallel. In other words, as far as I know, Cohen was certainly pro-Israel and pro-Zionist. I'm not at all doubting that. I don't know if Cohen really made that so much the focus of his activities. And as far as I know, he might have, I'm sure he had some connections with the Israeli Mossad here and there, Cohen was the sort of person who tried to make as many different connections with people who could help him or be useful to him as possible. Organized crime, the Catholic Church, corporations, wealthy individuals. And so, I'm sure he had some connections to, Mossad or, Israeli groups. I would, whereas Jeffrey Epstein, as far as I can tell, was basically a creature of Mossad. He was an outright Mossad asset or agent. And what he did was simply controlled by Mossad. I think in Cohen's case, he was more independent, though he might have, for example, traded favors with Mossad, maybe even traded blackmail evidence with Mossad. Roy Cohen was basically serving Roy Cohen. Everything he was doing was in the service of Roy Cohen, Roy Cohen's money, Roy Cohen's power, Roy Cohen's this and that. And so, whereas he might make deals with people, I think his ultimate beneficiary was intended to be Roy Cohen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think this is a good spot to wrap up this discussion. But before we leave, Ron, tell my audience where they can follow your latest work.
Sure. Well, it would be the Unz Review, unz.com. And in fact, I've really had a few articles that have gotten a lot of attention recently. In other words, one long article on what I called a true history of World War II. I'd been invited to give a talk on that subject at the Mises Institute. And so this article will be published as part of the proceedings of the Mises Institute. It sort of summarizes my view of the more accurate and true history of World War II. Another article I recently published that's gotten a lot of good attention has been, focusing on the massive amount of terrorism and assassinations committed by the state of Israel over its history. Not just, for example, in it, I certainly focus on the fact that there's extremely strong evidence that Israel played a central role in the JFK assassination and the 9/11 attacks. But there's tremendous amount of other assassinations and terrorist attacks, often against Western targets, that there's a tremendous amount of evidence for with regard to the state of Israel. And so, if you want to see a sort of compendium of a lot of it, I mean, that article certainly covers as much as I could put together in, I think it was probably about 11 or 12,000 words.
I highly recommend all of Ron's work, and I'm also have some articles that are republished every now and then there. And Ron's Review is one of the few spots where you will find ideas across the spectrum, the political spectrum, debated and covered. So with that, thank you again for tuning in to El Nino Speaks. And for El Nino Speaks, this is José Niño, and El Nino has spoken.